Welcome. Today, local Arden area author Bill Pieper is appearing here at BluMoon Books and will be signing copies of his latest book of short stories, Forgive Me, Father, after his talk. A bit about Bill. He is local Arden area writer, voyeur, exhibitionist, and hiker. When loosed on the world, he soaks it all up and re-scrambles into fiction stories. Stories by Bill have appeared in Farallon Review, Scarlet Leaf Review, and Blue Lake Review. Bill is also listed as notable alumnus of the Squaw Valley community of writers. One note, we will be taping the talk, and you'll be able to access the presentation later at BluMoon's Facebook page. Now we'll let our author begin.
Well, thank you, Jenna. And thanks to Lene and Patrick and BluMoon for the opportunity to appear here. As Jenna says, I'm Bill Pieper. I've been writing almost full-time since the late 1990s, but until 2011, I had actually never had a story published. I did it backwards. I started with longer stuff. I had not ever really felt the call to do short stories, and I was determined to write the novels, ideally the great American novel, but I thought that might come later, but ideally the great American novel. And so I fumbled around with novels and difficulties getting publishers and all the same familiar things. Managed to have a couple of books come out from small press publishers and engineered to have some come out, sort of semi-self-published with some partners. The problem that you run into with that always, however, is marketing. The large publishers have budgets, and they have agents who feed them talent, and they have the big publishers have a whole arsenal of things that they can use for promoting books. Everything from, TV teases to ease of getting reviews and all the things that the small fish don't have. And you can flack all you want as a small fish, but it's very, very hard to make up that gap. Occasionally, an independent press book will hit the sales marks in such an impressive way that a larger publisher will come along and buy it out. And so lightning could have struck, I guess, but it didn't. And I began to realize that was really the hard way to go about it. And I began to have, along about 2009 or 10, quite a number of ideas for stories, but I didn't have the toolkit to put stories together. So I thought that it was time for me to go back to school. And I applied to both the Iowa Writers Workshop, the summer workshop, and to the Squaw Valley community workshop that's up at Squaw Valley. And I was accepted at both on the basis of work that I submitted, and I know they don't accept just everybody, so I was pretty pleased. It was an incomplete version of a short story that is in the Forgive Me, Father book here that I'll read from in a bit. In any case, I was accepted, and it just seemed like a real grind to go as far from home as Iowa and do all of that, so I elected to go to Squaw Valley. And I just threw myself into it, as this man knows, because he came up while I was in mid-throw. And it's a kind of a place where I was in the short fiction strand, and I was a beginner with short fiction. I had ideas, but very little in the way of technique. And I freely admitted that to all the instructors so that they would understand what page I was on. And I just imbibed of everything available there from 9 in the morning till 9 o'clock at night, the entire week that I was there. And it did me an enormous amount of good. First of all, the reception of my work from the people in my workshop and from the instructors was such that it gave me a nice boost of confidence at a time when I really needed one. So, hey, I actually can do this. So, without laboring that point anymore, since then I have now had 25 and still counting short stories published, in various journals all over the place. Many electronically, some electronic and print, some print only. And this may sound a little, sort of snooty, but I actually have now lost count of how many I've had published. I used to think, wow, 1, oh, 2, whoa, 20 was impressive. So now I'm somewhere between 25 and 30, but I honestly don't know, and I'm not sure that I will ever again know. last year I really had a flurry of things. Not that I wrote them all last year, but just things that I've been working on. And, stories, you have to work on them. 3-4 drafts would be just absolutely the norm. Sometimes they stay stuck for longer than that. But anyway, I had 7 or 8 published last year, and I just received notice Thursday of this week from Red Fez magazine that has published several of my pieces that they've accepted a new one that will be out next week. My story, Guatemala, that's set in, well, Guatemala. That's not, however, in this book, and I'm not sure it will be in the next book. I'm working on now a collection of linked stories that will amount to a novel if you read them all in succession, but they don't necessarily have to be read that way in succession. The first 4 have already been accepted by different magazines to be published. One, in fact, will be coming out in the fall issue of the Chiron Review, which is a very lovely little literary magazine that I'm extremely pleased to get into, that's published in Nebraska, Kansas, I mean to say, in western Kansas someplace. And they do a lot of Western Americana kinds of things, and that story is called Wildflower Season. And it is set in the tiny town of Lamoille, Nevada, and it's very much a piece of Western Americana. So that'll be the lead story in the new book, which I envision as being called Borders and Boundaries. So that's a project. There will be 10 stories. I'm working on number 8 right now, and 9 and 10 are still in here. So, and the first, I don't know that I'm going to try to publish any more than the first 4, which I've now done, because I think I can go to a publisher and say, look, I know this is marketable. The first 4 have already sold. I'm not going to let the entire cat out of the bag now. How about we make a deal? So we'll see if that pitch works. I'm inclined now, I think, to go ahead and talk a little bit about this book, which is a dozen stories, and I think with the exception of 1 in here, this publisher wanted to have something that had not seen the light of day elsewhere. So there's one in here that's called Public Defender that has not been published anywhere else. But the others are all in magazines, and most magazines now are on the web, and then they pull together their best of into either a quarterly anthology or an annual anthology. And so you're doing it right when your stuff gets selected to be in the annual anthology, and that has happily enough come my way 4 or 5 times out of these stories. So that's going along. This one, I had tremendous fun putting these together because I didn't view it as a book. It was just whatever I felt like writing at the time. So it starts with the lead story, Forgive Me, Father, which is a little sidewise take on the sexual abuse scandals in the Catholic Church, but it goes into there's like a sci-fi alien porn. There's like everything you could name is in this book. I found out that on Red Fez that published that silly story Alien Dreams, which I wrote on a bet, another writer said, I bet you can't write sci-fi porn. So, and I said, you're right, I can't. But then it kind of I bet me a beer and said, can you do it? So I did do. In any case, that story, Red Fez gives you feedback on how many times your story has been read. That story has been read 20,000 times. And I wish I'd written it under another name besides mine, It's really not my style. But this one that I want to read today is the only real piece of flash fiction that I've ever written. Flash fiction nowadays is defined as 1,000 words or less. And so it's not easy for me to deal with 1,000 words. It's easy for me to deal with 2,000 words, and I've kind of run out of oomph about 4,000 words, but 1,000 words takes a lot of compression. So this one I'm proud of because I managed to get it published in a first-rank flash fiction venue, and it's the only piece under 1,000 words that I've ever successfully brought off. It's called Love on Hate. So let's tackle that. God, that dope was strong. She should have noticed how he'd stopped after one hit, and the booze and the pizza didn't help. Her stomach felt seasick like her head. It was dark and cold here, too, with just one shrunk-up threadbare blanket, and his couch was lumpy. Back home in Tracy, where her mom was probably calling everybody right now and super freaked out, the night would be warm, and she could have left her bedroom window open to the sound of crickets. That was the good part, but there were lots of reasons why she'd run away. The mistake had been running to the city. She'd heard about Haight-Ashbury for years, mainly from her grandma on holidays, and while her parents were still together, they always smirked and rolled their eyes. But when you got there, it was fucked. Nearly all day hitching on back roads to the Dublin BART, then changing to the wrong train in Oakland and taking forever to finally get off on Market Street, where she still had to walk blocks and blocks, lugging a school pack full of her stuff. Then she was on a grungy corner with staring tourists, dog poop, cars honking, smelly exhaust, and fog so cold and blowy it could have been winter. She knew about the fog from when her dad took her to a Giants game once, but nothing like this. 2 hours of shivering and hanging out, and she hadn't met anyone cool, or anyone really, until some punky kids came along, punkier than her, who shared their lucky strikes and joked and acted nice before they tripped her, held her down, and stole the backpack with her phone and most of her money in it. So after she stopped crying, it turned into panhandling for real, and she was scared, and it got darker, and she was just about to try a collect call home when someone gave her enough for a cup of coffee. As she huddled inside by the window drinking it, this man showed up, a balding black man, maybe as old as 50, wearing a fleece hoodie, sandals, and wild African-looking pants. "Hey, little lady," he sat at her table and pointed to himself. "Reverend Earl here." Ignoring him, she looked away. "You seem lost, hungry, and scared, sweetheart. How about I help?" "No, thank you." "Think about it," he went on. "Cold night? I got a place you can sleep, bit of food, maybe we get some laughs." She didn't answer, but she was really scared now, terrified. Sooner or later, the coffee shop with its buzzing yellowish lights would kick her out, and where else could she go? "Look," he said, "I'm safe. Man of God. Nothing to worry about." His place was uphill, 3 blocks away, a tiny dark storefront with swirling psychedelic letters across the top that said, "New Ark Pentecostal Church," and on a curtained window, Reverend Earl Jones, manicures, pedicures, and hair removal. Leading them through the deep gloom of a strangely cluttered interior, he took her hand, rigid in the supple warmth of his. Then they were in a tiny beat-up apartment where he lit one lamp. A small sink and counter along the far wall, a sagging couch, a table and chair, a doorway to a microscopic bathroom, and another door to a bedroom that was more like a walk-in closet. Everything smelled of cooking oil, overlain with a residue of incense. "Relax," he said expansively. "We got us some Southern Comfort, some good weed, and half a pizza in the fridge." She was crazy even to be there. And she only knew Janis Joplin like Southern Comfort, and she'd had hits on maybe 12 joints in her whole life. But pizza, that she really needed, and the couch too. "Okay," she said, can I use the facilities?" "Sure, little lady, help yourself." The rest just sort of happened. But they did eat, and Southern Comfort was spicy, sweet, hot, like Captain Crunch mixed with vodka. And the weed went around, whenever that got started, and he was so quirky funny she almost did laugh. But pretty soon she was falling asleep while he talked. "Gospel of love, that's my preaching. We all gotta love each other no matter who or where, and forgive each other, look out for each other, try to pay back whatever we get. You agree, sweetheart?" "Oh," he went on, "she's dozing off. Too bad this space heater's broke. Tell me your name and we'll tuck you in for the night." She heard that last part but slumped down more and stayed silent. "Okay, maybe in the morning." He tossed a blanket over her. "But you get cold, you let me know." He turned off the lamp. "There's body heat to burn in the next room." Off and on she could hear him rustling around, and she never actually slept. Not just because of her mind and gut, half drunk, half stoned, and half sick from eating too fast, but from knowing she'd set herself up to be raped. It wouldn't stop him that she was gay. Then his door opened and he came back in. "Got an idea, little lady. Just what a girl like you needs." Face up, still completely dressed, jeans and all, she squeezed her eyes closed and locked her knees together. He sat on the outer edge of the couch and pulled the blanket away from her feet. She stole a glance, and in the light from his doorway saw him holding shiny things on a tray. "I'm gonna paint your toenails," he said. "Fuchsia, the color of love." She heard her voice thin and weak, so she must have been speaking. "I'll tell my mom if you hurt me, because tomorrow I'm going home." "Good," he said with his back to her as he stripped off her socks and put cotton balls between her toes. "Glad to hear it." So that one's fun to write and fun to read. And I think my wife Kathy knows a good bit about where that story came from.
Yes. If you tell him something about your life, you may see parts of it later.
Yeah.
Elsewhere.
None of that story is literally true, but a woman that we know through Kathy did not run away from home, but with the encouragement of her mom, actually went up to, as a young woman, to explore the Haight-Ashbury, and she did fall in with this Joker character who painted her toenails. So, you know, it's not a big leap to reassemble those into a current day story in which a young person who's clearly getting some heat at home over her sexual identity opts to run away. You know, I mean, this is just an oddball little take on a familiar story. Any other questions?
Yeah, I used to live for about a year in the Haight, and you described it very well. I could just kind of funky apartment and the whole thing. Yeah, very well. Yeah.
Right, and I'm not writing about, you know, the hate of glamorous days, although I'm not so sure how glamorous it was in those days either, because I myself was there. But I'm not writing of the hate in the glamorous days. I'm writing of the hate. This would have been, you know, the early aughts probably. And I try to write in the sort of the unspecified present, so that with short fiction anyway, I don't nail it to historical events or anything, so it doesn't become dated. So, but I want it to have a contemporary feel, and I've sometimes written from, you know, male points of view, female points of view. Omniscient is a new trick that I'm trying to learn. And then the story Guatemala that's coming out in Red Fez next week is the first time that I've ever written a male character, but a man who is black, as the narrator character of the book. And I don't, you know, I had some counseling from a black, you know, very creative theater person, black friend, who assured me that she could not speak for all black people, but, you know, as this black, from the standpoint of this black woman, you could maybe do this a little bit better or that a little bit better. So, you know, we'll see how it flies. She also told me, don't be surprised if you get some pushback on this, because it'll be viewed in some quarters as cultural appropriation. But she said, we all have to get over that, you know, because she's played parts on stage that customarily go to white actresses and so on. So I'm taking her advice to heart. I suppose all publicity in many ways is good publicity, so if I get some pushback, it wouldn't necessarily be bad. Any questions from you folks?
Not a question, but a comment that the books that you've written, particularly the first, second book that you wrote, novels, were incredibly descriptive of the Bay Area, not just San Francisco, but the Bay Area. So that's been a real treat for me.
Well, that actually is my thing. The kinds of books that I like to read are usually embedded in place in some way. You know, whether it's a river runs through it or whatever, you know, I mean, the books that are classically embedded in place. And so if I'm writing about the Bay Area, it will be the Bay Area. This new book that I'm putting together, Borders and Boundaries, is written about that section of the California-Nevada border that is north of Reno, that really, when you're up there, in terms of topography, people, or whatever, you wouldn't know what side of the border you were on. The border is just a silly line on the map. Highway 395 wanders from one state to the other, and, you know, it's all quite arbitrary. So that struck me as a fun thing. You know, there's not a lot of fiction ever set up there, for one thing, so it's got a little uniqueness to it. And that struck me as just a fun thing to play around with, the idea of borders being so arbitrary on maps, and then the other borders that we create, or boundaries within our lives, well, maybe they're not as arbitrary as lines on a map, but they can be pretty arbitrary. So that's a fun thing to play around with. Anybody else?
Since you said in the Bay Area, you said you were in Haight-Ashbury, did you spend some time?
Yeah, I did live in the Bay Area from the mid-'60s to the mid-'70s, say. But I moved actually from there to the little town of Downeyville in Sierra County. And I've said many times that if I had to like throw something off of my resume, I'd throw graduate school out before I'd throw Downeyville out, because it was a very, very powerful shaping experience for me, and I learned a lot about myself and about people. And I actually did set a novel there, which I guess certainly of the novels, it's my bestseller. It's called Belonging, and it was published by Comstock Bonanza Press in Grass Valley, who've treated me wonderfully, and all their, you know, their royalty checks don't pounce, and, you know, all that. But again, very, very, very limited marketing budget. So that's how that goes. But again, Sierra County is a really distinct place with a really distinct local culture. So it's fun to work with that for me. I actually was even given, you know, the honor. The first time I'm joking, I broke the blood-brain barrier, because instead of going to a writer's workshop at UOP this past summer, I was on the faculty of a writer's workshop at UOP last summer, and I was assigned to write about to teach the writing of place, why it works, what you can do with it, and so on, because you can set your characters up with a place that's congruent with them, or you can set them up with a place that is, you know, the lost intellectual in the wilds of Shropshire in England, a la Thomas Hardy or Wuthering Heights. You know, there's all kinds of things you can do with place to both deal with place, but use it to amplify your characters or your plot. So that's the short version of my UOP presentation. Anybody else?
Or the current situation in Napa.
Yeah. World on Fire.
I was going to ask you, I'm Bill Sway. He spends a lot of time with his face in the computer. I'm wondering what you're doing in there right now. What are you working on?
Story number 8 for the Borders and Boundaries cycle. This one actually takes place in Sacramento, oddly enough. Well, my character Clay has been in the 2 previous stories as definitely a bad guy, and this story Clay is the narrator, and you will come to understand a bit by him. But I think that it's time for him to pay for his sins, and so this story will not end well for Clay.
We have a Clay here.
Well, there are the good Clays and the bad Clays, you know. So, anyway, that's what I'm working on now, and the story is called Hi Grandma, because Clay is now wanted by the Reno police for breaking into just one too many drugstores to steal opiates, and so he has to get out of town, and he decides that he knows that the grandmother of his former cellmate at High Desert Prison in Susanville, where some of these stories take place too. He knows that his former cellmate has a grandmother living in the Riverdale trailer park down on the river, and, you know, off of Del Paso Boulevard in Sacramento, and this grandmother is blind. So he realizes he can go there and impersonate his cellmate and make Grandma believe that he is the grandson, who she hasn't seen in a long, long time. Well, she can't see anyway, so it's kind of a moot point. And therefore, he has the perfect hiding place. So I told you he was a bad guy. I mean, I don't have to be a bad guy in life because I get to do it on the page. Anything?
A authors always have routines for writing? Do you like coffee up in the morning and then work for 4 hours? What's your schedule?
Well, my schedule is kind of, I used to be pretty diligent that way, and the morning is kind of my best time. But for whatever reason, well, actually I know the reason, I've taken on the project of trying to learn Spanish and going about it pretty seriously for the past year. So I'm using my writing time first thing in the morning to write a diary in Spanish each day to keep myself in practice and so on and so on. So I'm getting to my writing a little later, usually after lunch. So now, but I put in 3 to 4 hours most days if I've got a story going. But until I have the setting, because scene is really important to me, and the first line and the opening scene really locked in my mind, I don't start. And then once those things are in place, I can kind of, go. And that'll be a draft. Then I let the first draft sit for, 4 to 6 weeks, and then I'll do a redo, because you come at it with fresh eyes. And then I've got 2 writing groups that I participate, one in town here and one in Davis, and I'll run it by them and tighten it up. And it's probably like this Guatemala story that's being published in Red Fez next week. I began to work on in late February when Kathy and I got back from Guatemala on a vacation trip. So it's 6 month gestation period. That's about right on normal.
Did you have an idea to do a Guatemala story before you went, or did something strike you and you thought that'd be a good story?
Well, I had the idea for a story that I did not know what to do with. And going to Guatemala gave me that, wait, I could use that material but adapt it to Guatemala. And the story is this. In 2006, my son and I set out to climb Mount Shasta, and we ran into very heavy weather near the top and had to stagger down. I got hypothermia, and he had to save my life. Now, the good part of this is, of course, he's a paramedic, so it's really useful to have one along with you. But when someone has saved your life, it's an extraordinarily powerful experience, and when when it's your own son, it has changed the power dynamic in the family, in subtle ways, all to the good, by the way. So, but I have never really wanted to try to deal with that as memoir or as father-son. I know there's a lot of stuff that could be done there, and our friend James has urged me to try to write it closer to the truth. But I doubt my ability to deal with the subtleties of father-son and when it's that personal. But I've always, the mountain rescue, I mean, it's all drama. It's really cool. So when we were in Guatemala, to answer that question, I learned that there's a chain of very high peaks on the west, toward the west coast, the highest of which is Tajumulco, and it's 14,100 feet, almost as tall as Shasta. And it has, their winter is more like our summer. I mean, they're on this side of the equator, but nonetheless their rainy season and so on sort of parallels our summer. And it builds up, Tajumulco builds up a pretty good snow cap, and it's the Mount Shasta of Central America because people go there specifically to climb it. There's a climbing club in Guatemala City devoted to Tajumulco and all that. I mean, I had to research all this. And I found on YouTube, videos of people climbing it and all the rest. So it enabled me to put together a story of 2 men who don't like one another very much, who are climbing the mountain separately. They know one another, and there's almost a rivalry in how they will climb the mountain and what they will achieve by doing it. But then it falls to one to save the life of the other, and the dynamic is really changed. By that I felt comfortable to do, and I was using Guatemala as the setting, moved it far enough away from me that I could treat it as a writer rather than as a dad or as a memoir. I'm not fond of memoirs because I really don't. I don't trust the difference between memoir and fiction because I actually think that fiction creeps in. Fiction creeps into our memories, let's face it, day to day. So I'm not comfortable with the idea of memoir writing. This enabled me to sort of denature the situation and really go for it. Anybody else?
There was another occasion we were in Spain, and I said, honey, you should write a story about Spain. And you said, I don't have anything to say about Spain.
Yeah.
And then there came the story, que se llama
No pasarán. Yeah. Well, I've always been, for reasons that can't explain, fascinated by the Spanish Civil War as a historical event. And so, come to find out that the Spaniards remain fascinated by their own Civil War as a historical event. And in some ways, what's going on in Catalonia right now and the desire for separation from the Madrid government goes back to repression visited upon Barcelona and Catalonia by the Franco forces, because Catalonia was a center of the Republican loyalist government that opposed Franco when in his successful attempt to establish military rule. So they're still very aware of that history, and I was shown buildings that had bullet holes in it, like that's where they executed the priests, the side wall of this church, and the teachers. Yeah, I mean there were waves of repression. So I started reading up specifically on the history of the Civil War in Andalusia, where we were, and we were in some villages close to the Portuguese border, and that's close to where Franco first arrived. And then so there was a wave of you could say invading military troops came through, and then the loyalists pushed back so that whoever took the town then executed their most conspicuous enemies, stood them up against the wall, and the bullet holes are still there. So something like that has to leave a tremendous scar, and so kind of looking at the way that scar plays out in the present generation is the subject of that story, No Pasarán, which is a famous slogan from the war. It's from the Siege of Madrid. When the Franco forces were trying to take Madrid, the ragtag army who successfully defended it through 2 brutally cold winters, that was their rallying cry, No Pasarán, they shall not pass. Anybody else? Okay, we could declare ourselves done here. I've got lots of books for sale. They're our price cheap. Lene will be happy to take care of you in that regard. And thank you very much for coming, everybody.
Yeah,